I'd like, first of all, to welcome everybody to our Being Human Café event on German prisoners of war in British camps and to the re-education scheme. So I'd first like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Taylor, who's a member of the Research Centre of German, Austrian and Austrian Exile Studies, who's published on re-education in the prisoner of war camps and the contribution of the German refugees to German re-education. And I'm Claire George. I'm the Miller Archivist at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, and I'm responsible for the archives of German-speaking refugees there. And many of those archives came to the Institute through the Research Centre members. And before we get underway, I just want to alert you to the fact that we are recording this session, and it will be made available as a podcast. So if you don't wish to appear on the recording, please can you keep your camera turned off and place any questions or contributions that you want to make into the chat facility, and we will be monitoring that. If you do raise your hand and ask a question or comment in person, then your consent to be recorded will be assumed. Now, this event is part of the Being Human Festival, which is taking place across the UK between the 11th and 20th of November. Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities, and it's run by the School of Advanced Study at the University of London in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. And the events are taking place both in person and online this year, and you can see the full programme on the Being Human website, and I've put the website link into the chat box. And the festival can also be found on Twitter at Being Human Fest, on Instagram and Facebook, and the hashtag is hashtag Being Human 2021. Please help us to keep as many festival events as possible free, and also to improve the festival in years to come by taking a moment to fill in a feedback survey after this event. And again, I've put the link to the survey into the chat box, and your feedback really is very valuable to us, and we really would appreciate if you would take the time to do that. Also, if you'd like to support the festival by making a donation, please go to beinghumanfestival.org/support us. Thanks very much for that. Now, as this is a Being Human virtual cafe, we hope that you have your tea or coffee, as I have, with you, and perhaps you've even got a piece of cake with you, and hope you're sitting comfortably and are ready to participate and share your thoughts. So what we thought was that if you could add questions and comments to the chat box in the first part of the session, but then later on we'll invite people to join in on mic or on camera as they wish. So I'm going to share my screen first of all. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Okay, so first of all, just an overview of what we're going to do today. So we're going to first of all have a quick quiz, and then Jennifer is going to be talking about her research on re-education and the lecture programme of the re-education scheme. Then I'm going to give an overview of some of the records of re-education in the Paul and Charlotte Bondi archive. And then following that, we're going to have a discussion. So for the quiz, if you have a pen and paper ready, you can either note down your thoughts or your answers on a piece of paper and just keep it to yourself, or you're also very welcome to put your what you think is the answers into the chat box, and then we can all share them. It's entirely up to you how you do that. Okay, so.
Number one, how many prisoner of war camps were there in Britain shortly after the Second World War? That is approximately A, 3,000, B, 1,500, C, 750. Just give you a minute to think that one through, And the answer is B, 1,500. Can we have the answer? Yeah. These were so there were 1,500 approximately all over the United Kingdom, and these were located all over the country in urban as well as rural areas.
Great. Okay, so question number 2. How many German prisoners of war were there in Britain in 1946, approximately? Was it A, 830,000, B, 560,000, or C, 402,000? So again, if you want to share your answers with us, do feel free to put them into the chat box. Otherwise, you can just note them down on a piece of paper. The answer to this question is 402,000. So very large numbers of prisoners of war only began to arrive after D-Day in June 1944. And then there was another large wave after the German surrender in May 1945. So by December 1945, there were around 200,000. But then there was a further influx of POWs who were sent back from America, and also when POW camps in Belgium closed in 1946. Okay.
Question number 3. When did the last POW camp close? A, 1946, B, 1948, C, 1947. Just give you a minute to think about that. Write it down or put it in the chat as you wish. The answer is B, 1948. Now, this may seem a little late to you. The reason was that Italians had been repatriated first by 1946, and their labour was replaced by the Germans. And this enabled the demobilisation of British troops to be delayed so that the worst aspects of post-war unemployment that had been suffered after the First World War, these were avoided by this stratagem.
Okay. Question number 4. What percentage of the prisoners were thought to still be Nazis in May 1946? Was it A, 25%, B, 10 to 15%, or C, 50%? The answer was 25%. So according to a briefing document, this is according to a briefing document in Paul Bondi's papers, and a rough estimate showed that as a result of the political screening undertaken by the authorities, about 15% of the prisoners were thought to be reliable anti-Nazis. About 60% were sort of in between, undecided still, and 25% were thought still to be, convinced Nazis. Okay.
Question number 5. This is the last question. Which of the following questions were used in interviews with individual prisoners to screen for Nazi supporters? A, what would you do if I, that is the screening officer, were Hitler? B, would you agree that all the former occupied countries should be rebuilt first by the Germans, while Germany itself should be left as it is? C, who is the greatest man in history? D, for Germany, sorry, I'll repeat that. I'll start again. D, for Germany, was the war a good thing or a bad thing? I'll just give you a few more minutes to read through those again and see what you think. Claire, are we going to enlighten everybody now?
Yes, we can.
This is a trick question. The answer was all of the above. These questions had been reported to Paul Bondi by prisoners who criticised the questions as being inappropriate, unfair and ineffective. No doubt you will agree. This leads us to believe that there was no standardised questionnaire, but that the composition of the questions was left to the initiative of the individual screening officer. Now, the last question is particularly interesting. You might like to answer it yourself in your head, or put the answer in the chat, or let us know later. The answer was that the war was a good thing for Germany. Why was the war a good thing for Germany, you may ask? Well, the answer was because it destroyed Nazism and gave the Allies the opportunity to re-educate these poor benighted Germans. Thank you. So that concludes the quiz.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer.
Do we have any? I can't see any chat at the moment. Am I looking in the wrong place?
Nope, I don't think so. I think we don't have anyone in writing in there at the moment, but hopefully we may get some comments later. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our next section, and we're going to hear now from Jennifer, who's going to talk about her research on the lecture programme of the re-education scheme.
Can we have the slide, please? Right, thank you. I'm now going to talk about one specific aspect of re-education, that is the lecture programme. I based my remarks on my book, details of which are on the screen. The book itself is based on Paul Bondi's papers, which have been transferred to the archive, and it's also based on other archival sources. Shortly before the end of the war, the Prisoner of War Division of the Political Intelligence Department of the Foreign Office initiated an ambitious undertaking, a re-education programme for German-speaking prisoners of war. The aim was to wean the prisoners of war away from fascism and inculcate democratic principles. In the post-war period, various strategies were employed to deliver the project, including film, radio, theatre, newspapers, and the provision of educational materials, including books for a camp library. And Claire is going to tell us a little about the books later. The lecture programme, administered by the Control Office for Germany and Austria, COGA, began just before VE Day in 1945, and at its height, in the summer of 1947, engaged over 200 lecturers. In June of that year, that's 1947, over 1,000 lectures were delivered. The conception was based on the essentially amateur tradition of liberal values which prevailed at the time in the minds of many of the decision makers. Lecturers were free to choose any topic they pleased and would then travel around the country to various prisoner of war camps, delivering what was, in many cases, their only lecture. Could we have the next slide, please? This is an example. I'm not expecting anybody to be able to read it, but this is an example of a lecturer's report. It's only the first page. There were 2 pages of this particular one. So you see, it was quite, as well as giving the lecture, they had to report back on each occasion they gave a lecture. And the next slide, please. This is an example of travel itinerary. You can see that was just for one. That was just for one particular camp. Great store was placed on assuring the prisoners that the lecturer was expressing their own. That the lecturers were expressing their own opinion not those of the government, thus demonstrating one aspect of democracy in action. The proceedings were conducted in German, and the lecturer was expected to end the session by encouraging the prisoners to ask questions and, if possible, to debate with each other. Such liberalism was not, however, evident in the administration of the programme. Could we have the next slide, please? The title of the lecture had to be registered with the organisers in advance, and thereafter it was set in stone. Any deviation from the agreed wording resulted in a written warning. And this is, I think, a bit more legible. You can see this is a warning letter that Paul Bondi had for the crime of changing the title of his lecture. And it ends with, "May I remind you that this is an infringement of our regulations." Yet it must be observed that this high degree of official scrutiny of the topics to be delivered did not result in a coherent course of study. Reliance on the expression of personal opinion, personal experience, and any area of expertise that an individual lecturer happened to possess resulted in the prisoners being presented with an eclectic mix of subjects. With the exception of the training camps, which offered daytime courses, the camps at which the lectures were delivered were all working camps. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were not obliged to work, so technically the inmates of such working camps were all volunteers, presumably motivated by the pay and the opportunity to engage in meaningful activity. Prisoners worked a 48-hour week, which was later reduced to 40 hours, in agriculture, forestry, mining, road building, clearing war damage, and similar manual tasks. Lectures took place in their leisure time, that is in the evening and at weekends, and attendance was voluntary. As the restrictions on their movement were gradually eased in the spring of 1947, and the prisoners were permitted to leave the camp at weekends and in the evening, the audiences, which had been numbered in their hundreds, gradually diminished. In any event, the lecturers had always had to compete with alternative leisure activities, such as films and, in good weather, sporting activities. The demand to work hard was not confined to the prisoners. As the correspondence clearly shows, the lecturers were faced with a punishing schedule. Could we have the next slide, please? As petrol was still in short supply, the prisoners needed to be accommodated near their work. Thus, each camp had several satellite camps, and the lecturers were asked would be required to lecture several times in one day. This is just an example of Paul Bondi's work schedule for a fortnight or so in 1947. Just to give you an impression, don't expect everybody to be able to read that. Add to this the extreme weather conditions in the winter of 1946 and 1947, the inadequacy of the accommodation offered, and the frequent inability of the camps to provide efficient transport, it can be seen that the task of the lecturer was not one to be envied. Thank you. So can we have a look at the chat now?
Yes, we've got a couple of comments there about the quiz.
Right.
Some people didn't get so many right, but some people got quite a few right. And
congratulations! I should have said there are no prizes, unfortunately.
And Melinda says that the questions are extraordinary, so hard to know how to answer almost any of them, honestly, in 1946. And Enos has asked a question about how Paul Bondi got involved in lecturing.
Oh, yes. he was, I think it was his work in connection with the, what was it called, Claire? You're going to talk about it. The
German educational reconstruction.
Yes, their German educational reconstruction bulletin, wasn't? Yes.
Yeah. So
I think.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry. I think the first lecture he did was with a few buddies from there. I think they went to Ascot or somewhere near. Oh no, Wormwood Scrubs or somewhere. So yeah, to summarise, I think his involvement resulted from his work with other like-minded refugees.
Yes.
That seems fair, Claire. Do you want to add anything?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I'll show a little bit about his start of his association with the prisoner of war re-education now. So obviously what I'm going to talk about is the archive that Jennifer has already mentioned, the papers of Paul and Charlotte Bondi, which we were very grateful to acquire in 2016 as a result of Jennifer's close contact with the Bondi family. And the archive contains lots of fascinating records of the Bondis' lives, from pre-emigration life to wartime internment, through to their role in different aspects of re-education, which we're looking at today. So there are Paul and Charlotte. And so their archive contains prisoner of war camp journals, lecture notes, itineraries, reports, personal correspondence with prisoners of war, and administrative records of various kinds. So who were Paul Bondi and Charlotte Bondi? Well, Paul Bondi had been an exports manager in Germany. He was of Jewish heritage, though he himself was a Protestant. And Charlotte Bondi had been a graphic designer, and they were both arrested because of their relationship with Paul Bondi having Jewish heritage. And they eventually escaped and arrived in the UK in the mid-1930s. So this is Paul Bondi's application to join the lecture section of COGA, which was the controlled office for Germany and Austria, which ran the re-education scheme. And you can see here that it mentions Paul Bondi's activities in Bremen prior to his exile in 1935. But it also mentions his recent work in Germany when he was intelligence gathering on public opinion for the US Army. And those experiences in 1945 provided him with a lot of the material that he used in his lectures. In October 1945, at the same time that he began lecturing, he also took on the role of the editor of the Bulletin of the GER, or German Educational Reconstruction. And that was a voluntary organisation founded in 1943, which aimed to support refugee educationalists in post-war Germany. And through Bondi's association with the GER, he brought to his lecturing a wide perspective on re-education as a whole. So not just prisoner of war re-education, but re-education in Germany. And this is an editorial note that he added, which illustrates the importance with which he viewed prisoner of war re-education. And he reminds readers that the influence of the prisoners of war time in democratic society, even though it was in captivity, that experience would be alive in their minds on their return, and that their spirit could make or mar democratic educational reconstruction in Germany. Now, as we've heard, the lecturers would write up reports on their experiences at each camp. And we can see here some examples of Paul Bondi's reports of lively debates which followed his lectures. And we can also see on the left the briefing notes on the political complexion of the particular camp, which were given to him before his visit. Now, Paul was just one of a number of German refugees who were taken on as part of the team of prisoner of POW lecturers. And one difference that the officials noticed between the British and the emigrate or refugee lecturers was that due to language and cultural understanding, the emigrate lecturers generally tended to achieve a better level of post-lecture discussion. And given that the discussion was considered one of the most important aspects of the lecturer's work, sometimes even more important than the lecture itself, we can conclude that the emigrate lecturer's contribution to the scheme really was very highly valued by the division. And it must also have been very, particularly satisfying for lecturers to spark and maintain a good debate, particularly when this went against the expectations created by the briefing notes, as was the case in these examples here. But of course, much of the success of the lectures in sparking those debates would be partly, at least, down to not to them, the lecturers themselves, but partly on the type of camp that they were visiting and the political complexion of the POWs that it housed. So on a visit to Watton Camp in June 1947, which was a camp known for the number of committed Nazis that it housed, open discussion was clearly very difficult. And Bondi reports here on the queer mixture of half-truths and extreme nonsense of many of the arguments, though he noted that at least some of the POWs endeavoured to keep to the subject and to carry on a genuine discussion. And another major factor determining the lecturer's success in creating debate or maintaining a debate was the degree of preoccupation with events in Germany and also with daily life and conditions in the camps. Prisoners were often far more concerned with these issues than discussing the meaning of democracy in the recent past. So this is an example from Helensburgh camp. And here the reason for the deteriorating morale and the fact there was hardly any interest in the past was apparently down to four particular reasons, one of which was to do with prison camp life, and three reasons were down to the bad news that was coming from Germany. So Bondi was clearly deeply committed to the re-education idea, but he was also not naive about what it could achieve. And in this letter to friends in Germany from December 1946, Bondi reflects on his POW work and its importance, but he goes on to stress that education in democracy and humanity is not a game, but a real-world object lesson. And if it's not seen in this way, then the confrontation of theory and practice will lead to disbelief, mistrust, and indifference. And in the letter, he then goes on to worry that the reality that the POWs will face on their return to Germany may lead to a disappointment for which the re-education scheme cannot prepare them. And we can see from some of Bondi's reports that even before the prisoners returned to Germany, that contrast between the principles of re-education with the reality of the world that they were living in was creating a tension. So with POWs gaining more experience and a growing understanding of democratic ideas, there was more potential for a clash with the rigid military regime in which they were kept. And this point was expressed by POWs at multiple camps. So I just take one example of these at Plimpton camp, where one POW commented that still being regarded as a soldier long after you've ceased to see anything attractive in soldiering is particularly galling if you're trying to rid yourself for good of everything connected with militarism. But despite Bondi's concerns, there's no doubt about his commitment to the re-education scheme and principles. And in that same letter to friends in December 1946, he concludes his thoughts on POW re-education work with a comment that what really satisfies is the fact that everywhere and again there are individuals to whom one can really introduce something of moral substance and the power to resist. And of course, there were clear signs of this happening in some cases, of real progress being made with some POWs, as for example here at Morby Camp, where Bondi was impressed by a new acknowledgement of past wrongs and the desire to cooperate in democratic reconstruction. And that must have given some satisfaction. The belief in the power of re-education to bring about such a change on an individual level must also have been behind the other aspect of re-education with which the Bondis were involved, and that was the supply of books to camps, which was mainly organised by Charlotte Bondi. So in 1945-46, very few camps had many books, and many of them had none at all. Suppliers like the International Red Cross and the YMCA were nowhere near meeting the demand, and also these were aimed at camp libraries rather than individual POWs. And from October 1946, Charlotte took over as the UK agent for a German book club, the Bücher Gilde Gutenberg, which was a non-profit cooperative publisher and supplier of books, which had been itself been in exile since 1933. And when Charlotte took over that position, the UK Bücher Gilde members were mainly German refugees and a small number of POWs. But over the following year, POW memberships increased from 24 in 2 camps to dozens of POWs in over 20 different camps a year later. And that was in addition to the supply of books to camp libraries, which the Bücher Gilde also did. And Charlotte continued to supply the POWs until the last camps closed in 1948. Sorry, I wanted to also show you the membership cards. So this slide gives some sense of the numbers and the work involved. The club worked on the basis that members would order a certain number of books per year. And this shows a page from an order book of 1947, showing the quarterly requests, nearly all of which here are POWs rather than the refugees. And the image also hints at the administrative complexity of the work, because POWs didn't always have straightforward methods of payment. And they were, of course, also a very mobile population. They would be moved around from camp to camp. And of course, they also began to be repatriated, and then the camps would eventually close. And we can see here how Charlotte has tried to keep track of the POWs who've been repatriated. You can see the German addresses at the bottom, so that the books that they've ordered could be sent on to them in Germany. So although on a small scale compared to the number of POWs as a whole, the Bücher Gilde certainly contributed to the wider availability of books in the camps, and particularly when you consider that many books would have been shared around and passed around amongst the POWs. And perhaps also the impact of Charlotte's work should be seen not just in terms of the number of books supplied or the type of literature that the scheme gave them access to, but the fact that this scheme worked at the level of the individual POW rather than the camp as a unit. Because for prisoners held in a military regime, having some degree of personal choice and individual responsibility would have been a rare experience, and possibly has a humanizing effect. And it's also clear that from the many personal letters of thanks in the archive, what it meant to those individuals. And so I just want to end with this example, highlighting Charlotte's efforts in this respect. And it's an interesting one because it also relates back to the concerns that Paul Bondi voiced about how prisoners might feel on their return to Germany. So this is from a former camp librarian with whom Charlotte had exchanged many letters whilst he was in the camp. But this one is written from after his repatriation. And he writes from Germany that amongst various other difficulties he was facing, he and his wife, who was in France, were unable to visit each other due to the strict visa and passport rules which applied to Germans. And he said that this experience had led to him to question some of the ideas discussed in the re-education scheme. But he concludes by saying that her personal kindness and support are what has helped him to overcome these feelings. Okay, so that concludes my presentation, and I just go to Jennifer to see about any comments that we have in the chat, to see if there's anything there.
Yes, we
move on to the discussion stage now anyway, aren't we?
Okay, we have a question here from Melinda Hornton. Was there any limitation on what kinds of literature could be supplied to prisoners of war when ordering as individuals? I'm assuming the camp libraries had some kind of restrictions. Claire, would you like to comment on that? Or?
Well, from what I have read, I believe you're right that when ordering for the camp libraries, there was a censorship, but that there wasn't when books were ordered for individuals. But I think that, well, this is from the sort of official history that was written by Henry Faulks, who was in charge of the scheme, and this is his looking back from the 1970s. And I think he writes there that that there wasn't any censorship for individual orders of books, but nobody actually ever asked for books that were, sort of Nazi literature of any kind. Anyway, it just didn't happen. That's what he.
Well, as far as this Büchergilde was concerned, it did have a very strong profile. And I mean, they only published books that fitted this profile. It was left-leaning. I will go and get it when I get an opportunity to give you one or two examples. But one example that most people probably recognise is The Citadel by A.J. Cronin. Which showed, dealt with a young doctor who was anti-establishment. So it was that sort of thing. And Hermann Hesse too, I think he won the Nobel Prize in 1946, so they published Hermann Hesse. And then also, when you're thinking, one of the restrictions was not political or ideological. It was paper was in a very short supply. So these books had very short print runs, and quite often Charlotte had to say to the people, "No, sorry, is out of print." So that's an additional restriction. And there's another question here from Sarah Patterson saying, how did the individual prisoners make contact with Charlotte to order the books, and how did the payment work? On one or two occasions, you had an example of that, didn't you, Claire? That Paul Bondi or the husband of the person who started the original agent for the Büchergilde, Gutenberg, Käthe Auerbach, her husband, who was a trades unionist, who was called Walter Auerbach, had been to a camp and had recommended the book club. And Paul, too, had recommended the book club when he went to I say preach, to lecture at the camp. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Claire.
No, I mean, well, only that, I guess, because the prison population was mobile, that maybe actually I think I did read about prisoners who were being moved from one camp to another. They of course would tell each other about the scheme. So even if even if Paul Bondi hadn't been to that particular camp, or other lecturers who might have also it's possible other lecturers may also have have mentioned the scheme as well. But of course, as I said, there would have been that population mobility that would have meant that they might have just talked to each other on sort of mixing.
And the books were also supplied to the libraries as well in the camps. So it may be that that there was a central recommendation from these various agencies which supplied the libraries.
Yes. And I think the payment was made through.
Oh yes, payment. Yeah.
Was made through the official sort of channel of the chief of the camp, wasn't it?
Well, there was quite an interesting example of this. I think individuals are meant to pay by postal order or something like that. And so Charlotte had to send out invoices to individuals, I mean, as well as to the libraries, but to individuals. And there was one wonderful example of a bewildered commandant writing to her and saying, this particular prisoner is no longer with us, but could you perhaps tell me for what reason an individual prisoner has ordered such a thing? It was unusual, but and as Claire said, the camps, the prisoners were a mobile population, and they did move from camp to camp. So the invoices usually chased the prisoners. I don't think it was any sort of camp money. I think it was they were meant to pay in an ordinary way. And don't forget, in those days there were postal orders. It was and the prisoners did earn money. So that's probably how it was done.
Although I think this may have changed during that period when Charlotte was running the scheme, that how they were paid, it went from being partly camp money, and I think part camp money and part actual British money, and then it became more later on when things sort of became a bit more normalised, I guess, that they were paid in British money.
Right. Sorry, this isn't.
Sorry, I was just going to say I will stop sharing it so that we can actually see.
Yeah, the next. Oh, yes. So there's another question there. Who drew the picture shown at the outset?
Oh, sorry.
I assume it depicts prisoners of war in the expressionistic style. That's one for you, Claire.
Okay, so it's a lino cut by Otto Rehr, who's was born 1909. I think that's 1901 from 1901 to 1995, and he was in the Radwinter North camp, which was a youth camp in Essex, and it was on the front of issue 4 of the camp journal. So I managed to trace him to an area of North Germany, and I spoke to the local museum who have some of his paintings, but they weren't able to get to actually put me in touch with him, unfortunately. So obviously we've acknowledged it, and we hope we are using it not in a way that he would disapprove of. But,
sorry, yeah. We've done the picture, I think.
What was the proportion of British to emigrate lecturers? I think it was about 2/3 emigrate lecturers to 1/3 British. That's again according to Henry Falk, who, as I said, ran the was in charge of the re-education scheme and wrote the official history in the 1970s.
I'm just looking at the chat. How did Bondi? Oh yes, we've answered that one. Picture limitation. Individual make contact with Charlotte.
Thank
what
you.
Was the proportion? Yes. in answer to that, that was a quantitative question. What was the proportion of British to emigrate lecturers? I must mention another. We're talking about Paul Bondi because we're talking about this particular archive, and it's got 50 of his, approximately 50 of his lecturers' reports. Another well-documented, perhaps not quite so well-documented lecturer, emigrate lecturer, is Hermann Zinsheimer, who was a veteran theatre critic and journalist, and who had 7 lectures. And he was not in his first youth. He was older than Bondi, and he was newly married at the time. And he was heroic in travelling around the country in this bad weather. His papers are being published gradually, but I don't think they've been published in English. But I know it was considered that we should perhaps mention him as another emigre lecturer. Were there any women lecturers? Have we answered that one, Claire? No. Okay, yes, I can give you an answer. One of the women lecturers was, the name's got out of my head, Irmgard Lytton. Her son, Hans Lytton, was a well-known, I think he was a lawyer, a dissident lawyer who had been murdered in a concentration camp. I think I'm correct in saying that. And she sought safety in England, and she wrote a book about her son's experiences. And she, wait a minute. Yes, I think she was a lecturer. It may be that I'm conflating that with her talking on the BBC. I'm sorry. Perhaps I will withdraw that until I've confirmed it.
It rings a bell with me as well.
Yes.
But somebody else may know. Somebody else here may know and be able
true.
to
Yes.
put us in.
Yes. I think the answer, this is a very difficult question to answer, were there any women lecturers, because it's not been, the whole scheme has not been well documented. It was written about in the book that Claire just mentioned.
Jennifer, sorry.
No, carry on.
Well, I'm just going to say, Charmian is with us. And maybe
is she? Oh, yes. Well, let's invite Charmian to answer us on. So somebody's got to. Oh, yes, you're there. Hi, Charmian.
I'm here. Yes, later. I'm afraid.
Would you like to put me right on Irmgard Lytton? I think I was.
Yes, in fact, there are two women who come to mind. One is one you know more about than I. That's Adele Schreiber-Krieger. She was a lecturer in the camps. And then Irmgard Lytton, who wrote this book called A Mother Fights Hitler, Mother Fights Against Hitler. And she worked a lot for the Ministry of Information, went, as Jennifer said, went around giving lectures. But after the end of the war, she then transferred onto the prisoner of war education service and did indeed lecture. Whether she went, I've only ever found the one lecture. Whether she just gave the one and only one about her son or more than that, I wouldn't know. But the other woman I've come across is Adele Schreiber-Krieger, politician, who, again, I don't know what she lectured on, but presumably on political subjects. That's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you, Charmian.
I think we've exhausted the chat. Can you see any we haven't answered?
Not a question, but a comment, a very helpful comment from Sarah, saying that Faulks's papers are actually held at the Imperial War Museum.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Sarah. That's brilliant.
You can continue. If you don't, at this stage, we have to remind you that we are recording. So if you don't if you wish to ask a question on screen, if you wish to ask a question and not appear on screen, continue to put it in the chat.
Lovely.
If you're happy to be seen on screen.
Yes. Laurie Strauss has raised his hand, and you're very welcome to.
Good, thank you. This is exciting because I get to have like tea in England. It's as close as I'm going to get. Well, not cheers, but close enough. Anyways, thank you for organizing this. It's been really interesting. I'm very intrigued by the fact that he used debate as part of the education. Because we just had a situation yesterday in Canada. I'm an hour west of Toronto, but way over in the West Coast, in Kelowna, BC, where a woman thought that during a Remembrance Day ceremony was a good time to express her anti-vaccination views.
Right.
Yeah, right. So anyways, and I'm curious what, just because that part of the presentation seemed to go by so fast, when he felt that the debate was successful, what did he feel was successful? That those who were for democracy, I don't know what he felt was.
Well, let me put this in context.
Yeah.
Sorry, Claire, did you want to say?
I know.
Am I all right to answer this?
Absolutely.
We put it in context of people who are, shall we say, subjects of a totalitarian regime. There is no debate in a totalitarian regime. So, in fact, there was that having the debate was the gold standard. Possibly a previous step would be for for the audience to ask questions of the lecturer. But for the prisoners to debate among themselves, however it was done and whatever expression, was the gold standard. The ability to express contrary opinions, and to allow both opinions to be expressed. I'll just read you a couple.
So this wasn't a case of he took like half the room and said, you're on this side, the other half, like it wasn't a didactic thing. He let it.
No, they could, the very fact that you're allowed to express an opinion. Let me just read you two examples. There was no organised opposition, but it seemed that the back benches of the tent were occupied by groups of blacks. Sorry, that means Nazis. There were 16 contributions to the discussion. One of the debaters spoke 3 times and tried to start another time. He's a Luftwaffenfeldwebel, soldier by profession, and is faithfully repeating the Nazi lectures he attended. A large part of the audience tried to boo him down when he spoke of the Führer and the German superiority above all nations. Well, so here you've got a situation where somebody speaks for Hitler and thinks, will not tolerate any other opinion. In this particular case, there was no one. The contrary opinion was not expressed in words, but in gestures. And here's another one. A group of the NCOs had established a firm regime on militaristic and nationalistic lines. Participation in the discussion was almost exclusively restricted to NCOs wearing the full insignia of their rank. The impression was gained that nobody else dared to speak, and there was an atmosphere of general restraint under strict military discipline. So that was what they were trying to fight against. And in fact, on the occasion when Paul Bondi went to Wotton, where these XS men were, he was very impressed, not by the opinions that they held, but by the way that they would engage in a reasoned debate with him. I think, Claire, you made that point, didn't you?
Yes, well, I actually changed slightly the
Oh yeah, but you did that.
selection from that letter that, or from that report that I showed. But
Yeah,
he
you
went
did.
on to say that in the following evening after the debate where he said, you know, there were all these sort of arguments were being made that were, you know, half truths and nonsense. But the following evening, he'd had a very well, a more rational debate where he I think he'd quoted somewhere from Mein Kampf, and they had questioned him on this and said he said that they were sorry, but they couldn't remember, and they were beginning to sort of not really be sure about you know where they'd got ideas from. So they said, "Could you show us your copy?" And so he showed them the copy that he had, and they looked at it and found that found this quote on the page that he said, and they apologised for doubting him. So.
And there's another question in the chat here now. Has any research been done on those prisoners who did not wish to be repatriated? Oh, I don't know.
Oh dear.
Have we got any other hands raised? I can't see. Laurie, Strauss we've had. It doesn't seem, it seems as that. Can you see any other hands raised?
No, I can't see any other hands.
And it is 6 o'clock, so perhaps, is that Char? Is that your hand?
Yes, I could just say a word about prisoners who didn't wish to be repatriated. I don't know about academic research exactly, but there was a very, very good documentary on the BBC some years ago called The Germans We Kept.
Oh, yeah.
And that interviews quite a number of prisoners who chose to remain. Most of them married here, as it happened. Perhaps that was why they were permitted to remain. In particular, the footballer. Now,
yes, Troutman or something.
Troutman, that's Ben Troutman, yes. Yes, I mean, he became a hero, of course, because of his prowess in football. But yeah, there were quite a few who did remain. And I think in that documentary, it does give some statistics.
And Margaret Ives says, my grandfather helped several people get naturalisation papers.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. I remember as a child you telling me about it. I don't know whether people can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, okay. Yes, I'd only be about 9 at the time. It's about 1948. And my grandfather telling me how he's helping all these strange young men get naturalisation papers.
These were all POWs.
Yes. This was in a camp near Grimsby.
Right. And how had he got the contact with them? How had he made them?
Because he was a prison warden.
Oh,
he was a warden at the camp, but spoke German. But was helping with, I think, with the Red Cross afterwards.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the time. It's 6:05, so I think perhaps we need to bring proceedings to a close.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. It's interesting.
Good. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on, Claire.
I just wanted to remind everybody again about the evaluation form, and I would be really grateful if people could just take the few minutes to just fill that out, because it really will help us. And then I'd also like to say thank you again to Jennifer for her presenting and answering questions beautifully, and also to Jane for helping with organising. That's Jane Lewin. Thanks very much to Jane. And
before we go, we have we have a final slide
in case anybody would like Two. Okay, so anybody would like to see, oh, I should just move it forward. A little extra reading in case anybody would like to follow up.
There's a detail of my book on the left, which also has Paul's letters to his wife, which he was writing, which he wrote while he was lecturing, and a book by Charmian Brinson and Richard Dove, Working for the War Effort, which deals with the lecture programme in a final chapter, and also gives a biography of one of the refugees who devised it. I think I'm correct in saying, Char. So that would be also highly recommended.
Is that Renee Halkett?
Yes, Renee Halkett, yes. Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit more about him, Char?
Well, Renee Halkett was a very interesting character. In various different ways. He was an aristocrat, changed his name, took the name of his Scottish forefathers, Halkett, but he actually had a different name than that. He worked on black propaganda. Apparently was terribly versatile, could write and sing and act and so on. Immediately the war was over, he transferred over to the re-education of prisoners of war, and he was the secretary of the whole program for a while. And he fell out with them. He was sent to the camp where the officers were, and there in this camp was one of his cousins, who had quite a high rank in the German army. He had been condemned to be a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi. René Halkett thought he knew better than this. He knew him from childhood and so on. Thought this couldn't be the case, and was particularly concerned because in this camp there wasn't a proper re-education program. It was thought that it was really, they were really too far gone in a sense to warrant re-education. So he came back to London, had a row with the people organising the whole program, and in fact left the re-education program and became an artist. And there were all sorts of other adventures in his life that I won't go into now.
Thanks, Charmian. Okay, so I think we will draw it to a close there. So thanks again very much to everybody for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at another event soon.
Thank you, everybody.